There is a YouTube user who is a Seventh Adventist. He has put up a video some time back called The Sabbath in the Early Churches. What he's attempting to do in his video is to show other Seventh Adventists, I guess, where the Sabbath was the norm for the early church, apparently. And I found some things very disturbing about his video. And let me point out to you why I find some things disturbing. First, he uses one book he calls the Dialogue on the Lord's Day. He uses a quote off page 189, and the quote's fine. But the book is actually, now there's no big problem here, he just didn't write the whole thing out, there's no big deal. The book is actually called A Discourse in 6 Dialogues on the Name, Nation, and Observation of the Lord's Day. So he's actually building a case for the Lord's Day, or Sunday, in this book. But anyway, here's a quote that he puts up in his video off of page 189 of this book. And I quote, the primitive Christian had a great veneration for the Sabbath and spent the day in devotion and sermons. And it is not to be doubted, but they derive this practice from the apostles themselves, as appears by several scriptures to be the purpose, who keeping both that day and the first of the week, give occasions to the succeeding ages to join them together and make one festival, though there was not the same reason for the continuance of the custom as it was at the beginning of it. End quote. He's using that quote to try to show that even the apostles were worshiping on the Sabbath, or were keeping the Sabbath. But when you look at the quote, let me just look at the quote itself first before going into some more about this book. It talks about the primitive Christians held a great veneration for the Sabbath. If these were Jewish Christians, they would have held the Sabbath in high esteem because it's part of their culture, it's part of their background. So that's actually proving nothing to me there. But the one thing about it, the apostles themselves, he's trying to say here that the apostles themselves did this, but the word says, as it appears by several verses of Scripture. It gives the appearance that they were. Now then, before getting into that more thoroughly, let me say this about the book itself. The book is about the Lord's Day being the day the Christians worshipped in the early church, Sunday. He's not trying to build a case for Christians worshiping on the Sabbath in the early church. In fact, at the beginning of his book, right after he gives a title, it says this, an account of several canons, decrees, laws, foreign and English, for keeping it holy. Keeping what holy? The Lord's Day holy. The second quote he makes, the way of worship in the Church of England vindicated, and an office or collection of devotions proper for the day. For what day? The Sabbath day. So it's quite obvious from the beginning of the book the man is making a case for the observation of the Lord's Day by the early church. In fact, on page 204 of this book, if this person had kept reading the book, and I doubt very seriously if he's read this book at all. If he read the book, he doesn't know any more about the comprehension of a book than he does comprehension of the Bible, apparently. On page 204 of the same book, he says this, Gentiles were not part of the Old Testament covenant and were never obligated to observe the Sabbath. End quote. On page 55, he says this, it is my opinion that the Lord's Day was observed very early in the church. End quote. So the man is not making a case for the Sabbath, as this Seventh Day Adventist member leads people to believe. And when it says it appears that the apostles were doing this, the book goes on to basically destroy every argument the Seventh Day Adventist ever had, and this book was written in 1701. But this man destroys every argument the Seventh Day Adventist ever had. And he goes back and talks about chapter 13 in Acts. And Seventh Day Adventists have used the same thing before, trying to show where Paul and the apostles were actually worshiping on the Sabbath, or observing the Sabbath. It's kind of like this. If a Seventh Day Adventist is invited to a Methodist church to preach on a Sunday, and he accepts that offer, does that make that Seventh-day Adventist then a Sunday keeper because he went to a church he was invited to preach? No, it doesn't make him a Sunday keeper, does it? He's just going to a place to preach the gospel. And Seventh-day Adventists fail to realize Paul was not going there to observe the Sabbath. He was going there to preach the gospel to those people. He wasn't going there out of some obligation. In fact, the book goes on to talk about how Christians in those days, especially the apostles that is, did things out of liberty because they were free to do so, in which they worshiped on the Lord's day. They did things out of charity because for the sake of the gospel, going to these synagogues on the Sabbath, not to observe the Sabbath, but to preach the gospel to those people. In fact, when you look at verse in chapter 13 of Acts, it doesn't say anything about these people being Christians whatsoever. They were Judaizers who had brought some Gentiles into the church. And I think it's about verse 42 where the Gentiles talk about, we want to hear you about this on the next Sabbath. Excuse me. Then there's Sabbatarians who say, see there, they came back the next Sabbath and worshipped again. Little do they know this, that the Jewish reckoning days were first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, and seventh day, or the first Sabbath, the second Sabbath, the third Sabbath, fourth Sabbath, and so on. So when the Gentiles would say, well, we want to hear you the next Sabbath, they weren't talking about the next Saturday, they were talking about the next day, which would have been Sunday. Sabbatarians failed to make that connection. Apparently they don't know the history of the Jewish reckoning on days there, but they weren't saying we want to hear you next Saturday. They were saying we want to hear you tomorrow about this, or the next day. The next Sabbath to them would have been the next day. So the entire book is not about early Christians observing the Sabbath. In fact, it's making a case that they did not observe the Sabbath. And the only time that Paul or other Christians ever went to the synagogues was out of charity to carry the gospel to those people. They weren't going there out of obligation to any Sabbath day. They were going there to preach the gospel. It is very clear that when Paul actually went to worship the Lord, it was always on the first day of the week, or Sunday, or the Lord's Day, as it became known by the time of the Apostle John. It was so obvious by then, it became known as the Lord's Day. Another book he used was a book called The Whole Works of Jeremy Taylor. And Taylor's doing much the same thing as the book on the dialogues of the Lord's Day. He's making a case for the Lord's Day. He's not making a case for early church worship on Sabbath. He makes a quote out of there that came from page 416, and you can look at the video and see that quote. But he failed. If he'd have just followed through with it, and again, he hadn't read this book. There's no doubt in my mind he hasn't read this book. On page 417, here's what that same author said. After he was showing pretty much the same thing as the dialogue on the Lord's Day did, that Christians only went to these synagogues to preach the gospel. He says this on page 417, and I quote, after they had kept the Sabbath, let everyone who loves Christ keep the day of the Lord, the day of memorial of his resurrection, which is the queen and the supreme of all other days. So in neither book was the author making a case for early Christians worshiping on the Sabbath. They were making their case that early Christians, as they did, worshiped God on the Lord's Day, or the first day of the week, which was Sunday. And the only reason they ever went to these synagogues was to preach the gospel, not out of obligation, but out of charity and love for their fellow Jewish people. They wanted them to hear the gospel. They were no more observing the Sabbath, the Old Testament Sabbath, as a Seventh-day Adventist minister would be by going into a church on Sunday to worship on a Sunday and preach the gospel. He would not become a Sunday keeper simply by going into a church on Sunday to preach the gospel, any more than Paul would be a Sabbatarian by going to synagogues on Saturday to preach the gospel. Again, out of the works of Jerome Taylor, page 417. After they have kept the Sabbath, that every one of them that love Christ keep the day of the Lord, the day of memorial of his resurrection, which is the queen and the supreme of all other days. I suggest that the author of the video of the Sabbath in early churches actually read the books before he makes the quote and puts it in the proper context. Until next time, this has been Golly saying, God bless.